With the release of 2.0, Kuro gave us not one, but two new holograms to challenge players, and I've had a lot of fun learning these fights, with a fair bit of frustration mixed in there while I was trying to beat them for the first time. So in this video, I want to talk about the two new holograms by going over their attacks, then have a discussion about them, including some tips that I've found for dealing with their attacks, any issues that I've encountered, my thoughts on each of the bosses, and finally, if either of the two new holograms are now the most difficult hologram in the game. Now, a couple of things to mention before we get started. The mechanics for each boss is going to refer to the difficulty 6 version of each fight, as they are typically the most advanced version of each boss and the version most people are likely to struggle with. I'm also going to talk about each boss separately, starting with Fallacy, so I'll make sure to put chapters in the video if you want to skip ahead. Also, I am going to go over each of the boss's moves before we talk about them, so if that part's boring, just skip to the next chapter. So let's get started with Fallacy of No Return's moveset. In Phase 1, the boss will do some very predictable moves based mostly on the player's position. There's a few main combos that we'll go over and talk about what you can do to trigger them. If you're close to the boss, she will perform a shoulder check or tackle, which will lead into one of two combos based on your distance to the boss after the shoulder check. If you're close after the attack, she will perform a ground stomp, which is followed by a ground shockwave. After that, she'll lift her hammer behind her and slam it down to the ground, which will be followed up by a pulse that travels outward along the ground from the point of impact. This is a very common combo melee characters will see. Something quick to mention about the ground pulse, this won't do damage when it's collapsing inwards, however when it pulses outwards you should either jump over it or dodge through it. When you're further away from the boss after the shoulder check, she will perform an upward swing with her hammer, sending a ranged crystal attack traveling along the ground for a short distance, followed by a powerful hammer swing that cleaves in a short area in front of her. After this, she will do a ground stomp, doing damage in an AoE. Those are her two shoulder check combos. If you're a medium distance away, she will do a similar combo to the shoulder check range combo, just without the shoulder check. The next three combos will all start with the boss teleporting away. If you're a long distance away from the boss, she'll teleport near you and do a ground stomp, followed by a hammer slam with a ground pulse shortly after. The next attack that she'll do is a teleporting combo, starting with a hammer cleave, followed by a stomp, followed by an overhead hammer slam with a ground pulse, and finally teleporting high in the air before slamming her hammer down to the ground, followed by another ground pulse. The last attack that she'll do in Phase 1 is doing a scream, which will slow down the player and spawn 4 pillars with grapple points. After this, the boss will do a triple hammer combo with each hit spawning a ground pulse. At the end of this triple combo, she'll launch into the air to do a final big slam, which will destroy the pillars and is followed by a ground pulse. At the very beginning of this hammer combo, the 4 pillars will send out ground pulses themselves, which the player will need to dodge if they're on the ground. This will also happen at the end of the combo when the pillars are destroyed. There are 3 ways of dealing with this attack. You can dodge it like a real gamer.
I'm just glad I'm a real gamer.
You can panic spam grapple.
I pooped my pants.
Or you can use a character like Camellia and float in the air above the combo, or use a character with an air combo like Chun-Li to stay off the ground. During Phase 1, if you stay in close to medium range, she'll typically perform 3 attack combos, followed by either a teleporting combo or the pillar attack. If you constantly move away from the boss, she will do 1 ground stomp and hammer slam, followed by the teleport combo or the pillar attack. So in Phase 1, you can pick your preferred range to force certain attacks, making this phase very simple and easy to get used to. Phase 1 will last until Fallacy's health reaches 66%, which will initiate Phase 2. You'll notice the start of the Phase 2 transition attack when Fallacy seems to get staggered backwards. This is a great time to do some quick burst damage, as she will do a fairly long animation before the next attack. However, once Fallacy finishes and flies up into the air, you will see 3 circles spawn. Each of these will spawn 2 homing orbs to attack the player that either need to be dodged or they can be parried. If these are parried, the orbs will be redirected to hit Fallacy instead. After this, Fallacy will do a twin laser attack, which will spawn 2 trains that intersect where the player was standing when they spawned. They don't track the player, so this is very easy to avoid by just moving out of the way. After this, Fallacy will shoot a barrage of homing orbs to repeatedly attack the player's location. This will be followed by another parryable homing orb attack, and finally she will slam her hands down doing AoE damage, followed by a second slam of AoE damage. This is the end of the transition attack and begins phase 2. In phase 2, Fallacy will mostly do punching attacks with no real order, but she does have a typical combo she'll follow that we'll talk about after going over her attacks. First, she'll do a quick parryable punch attack that, if parried, will stop the attack. However, if you choose to dodge or it misses, it acts very similar to the shoulder check attack from phase 1. If you're close to Fallacy, she will follow this up with a left hook before punching the ground, doing AoE damage. This is followed by an AoE shockwave. If you're at a medium distance, she will follow this up with another parryable uppercut attack and launch Fallacy into the air. Then while she's in the air, she will do the laser train combo, and finally, she will quickly position back down to the ground, doing a large AoE ground stomp. If you're further away after the fast punch, she will teleport higher into the air and do an orb barrage attack. This will be followed by a reposition where she'll then slam her hands down to the ground doing AoE damage before doing a small jump and slamming her fist down doing AoE damage. Her next attack is very simple, as she'll just float up into the air for a bit before coming back down to do the large AoE stomp attack. Her next attack combo, she will do a quick left hook, followed by an AoE ground punch, which will cause an AoE shockwave shortly after. This will be followed by an uppercut, launching her into the air, before finally doing a double fist AoE slam attack. For the next attack, she will do a come at me bro pose, shooting multiple volleys of orbs in a line in front of her. This next attack is one the boss is most known for. She will float into the air and charge herself up before launching forward towards the player and doing a multi-punch combo, after which she will reposition backwards and charge one more long-ranged, powerful punch. The easiest way to deal with this combo is to just spam dodge while trying to move around to the back of Fallacy, but another way that you can deal with this attack is by parrying the multi-punch combo. This can allow you to not only deplete her vibration bar, but also do some damage through the attack. Her next attack seems to only be triggerable after a successful parry, as when I was testing, she wouldn't do it at all if all I did was dodge. She will move to the center of the arena and do a scream, spawning 4 pillars with grapple points above them and a grapple point above Fallacy. The pillars will each emit 2 rounds of ground pulses while she screams, and then after a short duration, another round of ground pulses at the end of the attack. However, while she's doing this animation, if you hit Fallacy with an attack that can parry, she will stop the scream and destroy the pillars. The last attack that she'll do in phase 2 is the hammer combo, where she'll summon her hammer before doing a multi-hit combo that spawns ground pulses after each strike, before jumping into the air to do a final AoE hammer slam, followed by a ground pulse. In phase 2, she'll mostly do these attacks randomly, however you can force her to do the multi-punch combo by just staying at a good distance away from the boss. But as for the sequence she'll follow, she'll typically do 3 random attacks, followed by the hammer combo. However, if you parry one of her parryable attacks, she will immediately follow this up with either the hammer combo or the 4-pillar scream attack. So what are my thoughts on the Fallacy hologram? It's a really good fight that honestly isn't that hard, but does hit very hard. So people who are somewhat confident in their abilities to dodge and parry will likely learn and breeze through this fight pretty easily. Whereas people who pay less attention to the fight and focus more on their rotation will likely have some issues with clearing it. However, the fight itself is very fair, and if you fought the Tower of Adversity level 100 Fallacy before, a lot of its moves will translate to this hologram, making it so that there's very few surprises for the player. However, for those who are struggling with the fight, I do have some tips. The vast majority of Fallacy's attacks will do a small flash just before you need to dodge, so you can look out for that if you're struggling with timing. Not all of her attacks will do this, but the attacks that don't will typically also have very good tells themselves. Her parryable fast punch can actually hit you through a successful parry attempt, so treat this the same way that you would treat Heron's swoop or Tempest dash attack. If you don't know what I mean by that, it's always a good idea to try and parry an attack, but immediately after you try, you should also dodge as well to protect your character from damage in case something goes wrong or you get the timing wrong. Using this strategy against attacks that can hit you through a parry attempt can allow you to both parry a boss and perform a perfect dodge for a dodge counter. I really hope they fix this issue going forward, as even though it is cool to dodge and parry at the same time, it makes the feedback for the parry feel pretty shit. In both phase 1 and 2, the fight can be a lot easier if you maintain a certain distance from the boss, as especially in phase 1, this can force specific combos from the boss, making it so that you don't need to learn multiple combos, you just need to learn a few of them very well. One thing to watch for in this fight is the ground pulse attacks created by hammer attacks and the pillars. These are actually very simple to dodge, and the hardest part about dodging them is remembering that they're there. They might only do a little bit of damage, but any health that you lose to chip damage could be the difference between surviving a hard-hitting attack and dying to it. When Fallacy is transitioning to phase 2 and does the orb barrage, don't try to move and dodge, just dodge instead. When you do a dodge but don't move, it will only do a small backstep, which will increase the odds of you being able to dodge the next orb and maintain your iframes during the attack. Lastly, a lot of Fallacy's attacks can be avoided by just being a little bit off the ground. So characters like Camellia, Chun-Li, Zhe, and Ling Yang, they can avoid a lot of her attacks while still doing damage. In terms of issues with the fight, there aren't really any big ones other than the parry punch hitting you through the parry. So I personally really enjoyed this boss as it feels fair, strong, and really cool to fight. I like this boss a lot, and it gives me similar vibes to Crownless, feeling less like a monster and more like a rival, which I really like. However, 1, it doesn't have that many attacks for you to learn, and 2, because you can somewhat force her to do certain attacks, she reminds me a lot of Monkey. Monkey also hits very hard, but it basically does the same attacks in the same order every single time, making it a very easy fight to learn and really only punishes mistakes. Fallacy feels like Monkey 2.0. It doesn't have the same repetition Monkey does because phase 2 has less of a sequence to follow, but because you can somewhat force and predict certain attacks based off the amount of attacks the boss has done, your distance to the boss, and whether you've chose to parry an attack, it's really not that hard and you can actually set up a plan for yourself to beat it. However, like I said before, it's a really cool fight that reminds me of Crownless, and I'm willing to give this hologram a 9 out of 10. So let's move on to the next hologram, the Sentry construct, starting with its moveset. The Sentry doesn't technically have different phases, however it does have 2 different states. There's a normal state and what I like to call the annihilation state. In the normal state, the Sentry's lights will be a light blue, but when its health drops below 50%, it will enter the annihilation state and turn its lights red. However, to make it easier to talk about and hopefully understand, we will refer to the different states as phase 1 and phase 2. It also has 2 different modes, those being ground mode where it will do ground attacks and flying mode where it will do aerial attacks. So first let's go over the ground mode attacks. It will always start the fight by doing a parryable swipe attack, and if this isn't parried, it will lead into an uppercut attack, launching itself into the air, and then slamming a drill into the ground, doing AoE damage. This is then followed by an AoE frost explosion around the drill. Something to mention here, the drill itself will hit you multiple times and stagger you, so trying to dodge away from this attack is typically a good idea. This is the only time that you'll see this parryable attack appear in the fight without making the boss do a special gap closing attack. The Sentry does have a second nearly identical combo that's not parryable. The only difference is the way that it starts the first attack. The special gap closer I mentioned will have the Sentry crouch down before leaping into the air and doing a slash attack upon landing. This is then followed by the initial parry combo. The next attack will have the Sentry move backwards and ready a parryable blade stab. And if this isn't parried, it will be followed up by a Beyblade spin attack that will spin either 2 or 4 times. If the boss only did 2 spins, it will follow up with a fast slash attack, sending blade waves out in a 180-degree radius, which will be followed up by a fast ground slam that will immediately freeze the player if it hits. If the boss does 4 spins, this will end the combo. The final hit of this Beyblade combo will hit a shitload harder than the regular spins. There is a second blade stab attack that isn't parryable, and if you see this variant, the Sentry will follow it up with a fast blade wave slash, followed by the freezing ground slam attack. This is also the Sentry's general gap closing ability. The freezing ground slam is also a standalone attack that is very fast, hits in a massive area in front of it, and freezes any character's hit. If the Sentry lifts its left arm into the air, it's gonna do a ground stab, dealing AoE damage, followed by a second AoE frost explosion. If the Sentry lifts its right arm slightly, it's gonna stab its claw into the ground, dealing damage in an AoE that's a lot bigger than you'd expect. This will be followed up by a claw slash, sending an ice wave forward for a short distance, followed by a second slash before lifting its arm into the air and slamming a drill attack into the ground, which shortly after will shoot out an ice wave. The next attack, the Sentry will dash away before changing its arms into Gatling guns, where it will spray bullets in a line in front of it. This attack will do a stagger to the player at the very beginning of the bullet barrage, however it doesn't do damage to the character. Having said that, if you're too close, you're likely to be hit by the bullet barrage while recovering from the stagger. If the Sentry dashes backwards while spinning around, this indicates a hurricane attack that covers the whole arena in a straight line in front of the Sentry. It will slowly sweep the hurricane to the right across the arena. You can either dodge through the hurricane, or you can run to the right if you're close enough to the Sentry. It doesn't sweep the attack very far before lifting it into the air and slamming it down to hit the player. On impact, the area hit will become icy and inflict the player with a Glacio debuff, and it will also shoot out 2 ice waves on either side of the explosion that hit in a deceptively wide area. If the Glacio debuff reaches 10 stacks, the player will become frozen and will need to break out of the freeze. When the Sentry's vibration bar is low, it can enter a shield or defense state, where it backs a short distance away from the player and does a shield slam attack and entering shield mode. While in this mode, it will rapidly regenerate its vibration bar and will receive reduced damage. If the Sentry is left like this for too long, it will do a pulse attack that is incredibly fast, followed by a fast blade wave slash, then a freezing ground slam. It will also do this attack combo if the player tries to move around the sides of the Sentry while it's in the defense state. There are a few ways to deal with this attack. You can grapple over the top and attack it from behind.
What are you doing, Step?
Silence wedge.
Dealing melee damage from behind will break the shield state and stagger the Sentry. Another way to get past it, if you have a character like Chun-Li who can perform aerial attacks, you can use their movement to get behind the Sentry. You can forcibly trigger its counterattack by dashing to the sides of the Sentry. This is typically pretty safe, as the fast pulse attack should hit you while you have iframes from your dash. And the last option is to spam attacks in front of the Sentry, and maybe one of them will get through and stagger the boss. This is the most risky strategy, as you either need good reflexes or timing to dodge the initial pulse attack, but the other downside of this is if you accidentally move too close to the sides and prematurely trigger the counter. The next attack the Sentry does is a grab attack. This will be indicated by the Sentry suddenly flying backwards into the air before dashing towards the player and trying to grab them with its claw. The last ground mode attack is an ultimate, where it will do a fast upward slash, launching itself backwards before charging up energy. After some charging time, it will release some of the energy in an AoE attack. This is indicated by a flash just before the attack. After this, the boss will take off forwards, doing damage in a line as it does, before flying around the arena and shooting multiple ice missiles towards the player's location. On impact with the ground, these missiles will do small AoE damage and leave behind a frost swirl ground effect that will not only apply the stacking Glacio debuff to the player if they stand inside it, but will also explode after a short duration, dealing damage in a slightly larger AoE. After it shoots all of its missiles, it will prepare a drill slam attack, where it will have a ground indicator on the player for where it will land. Shortly after the ground indicator flashes, the Sentry will slam down to the ground, doing massive damage in an AoE, followed by multiple frost explosions shortly after. That's all of its phase 1 ground moves. So let's move on to the flying moves, starting with the ground to flying transition attack combo. The Sentry will crouch down before shooting off to its right and into the air. The takeoff itself will do AoE damage damage, and also damage in the line the Sentry took off in. It will quickly circle back around, charge up its blades, and then move towards the player, doing a cross slash attack that also shoots out blade waves in all directions. While the Sentry is flying, it will sometimes do a quick reposition before some of its attacks that will shoot out 2 ice missiles. It can do this reposition a couple of times before an attack, which will shoot out 1 to 2 more ice missiles for each additional reposition. One of the flying mode attacks it will do is it will cross its arms in front of its chest before dashing forwards towards the player in a straight line and dealing damage. After it travels a fair distance, it will do the same attack again, traveling back towards the player. Another attack it has, it will start to shine from the center of its body before summoning multiple ice crystals to attack around the player's location. The Sentry will remain stationary during this attack. The next attack is a flying version of its ground Gatling attack, where it will reposition behind the player before shooting the ground with 2 Gatling guns, hitting multiple times. This attack will also initially stagger the player, and if you're too close, you will almost immediately take damage after the stagger. Next, it has 2 parry combos. The first will have the Sentry do a parryable spin attack before charging up its blades and doing a cross slash attack that shoots out a bunch of blade waves. The second is the same as the first, with an extra parryable spin attack immediately after the first. If any of the parryable attacks are parried while the Sentry is flying, it will be knocked down and fall to the ground, ending flying mode. However, there are 2 attacks the Sentry will use to end flying mode. For the first attack, it will do a quick spinning slash attack before slamming down to the ground, dealing AoE damage, which is shortly followed by some ice explosions around the AoE attack. The second attack is similar to the ground ultimate attack. This attack will immediately start after the second parry attack combo, where it will fly up high into the air and put an AoE indicator on the player, doing the same massive AoE damage ability as the ground ultimate, followed by ice explosions shortly after. This is all the attacks you can come across while the Sentry is in Phase 1. So what's the difference between Phase 1 and Phase 2? Phase 2 is basically a harder Phase 1, having all the same attacks, but it will go into shield mode and flying mode less often. It adds a ranged blade wave to certain attacks that can catch retreating players off guard. It can mix some of its different regular ground combos together to surprise the player. It has a unique right claw ground stab attack that it will do right after the left arm spike attack that hits in a much larger area than the original. Other than that, the fight is exactly the same. There may be some more unique attacks in Phase 2 that I'm unaware of, as this boss is very complex and has some really unique traits. So what are my thoughts on the Sentry hologram? It's a somewhat fast-paced fight that rewards good positioning and fast reactions. In terms of complexity, this boss is kinda unique, being able to string together different combos to surprise the player during Phase 2. Not only that, it has one of the coolest ultimate attacks in the game where it launches into the air and crashes down in a massive ice explosion. It does have a couple of issues, like some of the attacks that you're trying to parry can just miss.
What are you doing?
What are you doing?
No, what are you doing?
What are you doing?
No, what are...
Its grab attack can just miss as well.
Miss.
You are made of stupid.
No, you is blind.
The boss can just randomly stop working and just sit there doing nothing.
I can do this all day.
A few moments later.
Well, this sucks.
And the final hit from the Beyblade attack can hit you if you're too close to the edge, even if you dodge. So the fight does currently have some issues, but hopefully over time, these issues should be ironed out. However, for dealing with the boss right now, I do have some tips. If you're trying to parry the ground attacks, try to position yourself in front of the boss. And when you're trying to parry aerial attacks, try to position yourself a medium distance away from the boss. Both of these little adjustments dramatically increased the success rate of my parries, as when I was too far away from the boss, they just wouldn't work. And if I was too close, it had a 50-50 chance of working depending on the character. Also, one other thing to mention about the aerial parries, just know that some attacks will currently trigger the parry and stop the damage, but won't knock the Sentry down out of the air. A general rule that seems to work most of the time is melee characters' basic attacks will almost always knock it down. I honestly don't know if this is intended, but it does feel like it's a bug. The Beyblade attack can hit your character in the first spin's wind-up if you're on the right side of the blade, so if you don't plan to parry the blade stab, dodge to the left so that you don't need to do the extra dodge when it starts to spin. If you do end up on the right side, just remember to dodge as the blade swings around, and then dodge the first spin a second time. With the ice missile attack, you can choose to just run away from it and you shouldn't get hit. However, there are two easy ways to deal with them. You can dash in the direction the missile is coming from, giving you the best chance to actually dodge them. However, another way that you can avoid them, because they don't try to hit the character and aim at the ground instead, you can just float in the air to avoid them or do a mid-air combo. And one last tip, if you parry one of its ground attacks, don't immediately follow that up with something that will animation lock you. After a ground parry, it can immediately go into its flying transition attack, and if you can't move or swap characters, that transition attack can do a shitload of damage, which can easily one-shot a character. One thing that I'll say with this fight, I was initially going to clear it first time with Chisha to showcase her with Carlotta's weapon. However, while I was learning the fight, I started to feel like the fight would be way harder for melee characters, so I opted to clear it with Shang Liao instead. However, after the initial clear and I uploaded the video, I sort of started to realize that the fight is harder for melee characters, but because they can parry, it's actually easier in certain regards as well. Since then, I have also soloed the fight with Chisha, and I'll have that gameplay at the end of this video if you're interested. However, in my opinion, this is a really good fight because it doesn't really cater to one style of play, having both pros and cons for both melee and ranged characters. My overall opinion of this boss is actually pretty high, but because it has some issues right now, I'm only going to give it an 8 out of 10. However, if they fix the issues with this fight, this is one of the best fights in the game currently. One of the things I really liked about this fight was the fact that the boss loves to move away from the player, but it doesn't break lock-on, making it really easy to keep the boss on screen. Really good decision to add that for this fight, and I hope Kuro thinks about doing the same thing for the rest of the holograms, especially Morning Aches. Last thing that I want to talk about quickly is some of the positives of both fights, but also some issues that both fights currently have. So let's start with the positives. The arena itself is a really good size for hologram fights. It's a flat, large, open area where you can just worry about what the boss is doing without having to worry about the environment. Really good choice to add both fights to the same arena as well, as it allows us to quickly transition from one hologram to the next, and I would also assume this is why they were able to allow so much space for the arena. One thing that I really liked about the two holograms is they feel like they're more in line with the originals than they do with Crownless or Inferno Rider. Hard-hitting attacks, stage modifiers that apply equally to both teams and solo play, and mechanics that don't try to manage your positioning too much. With Inferno Rider especially, I was a bit concerned about what the future of holograms was going to be like, given the direction that they were going, but what Kuro has delivered is a really welcome change of pace. However, there are also some negatives with both fights. The edge of the hologram arena has a semi-transparent effect to let you know where the boundary is. However, if you're fighting near the boundary and the camera ends up behind it, it can start to make the fight harder to see and distracts the player's attention away from the fight. I would prefer if when the camera was behind this effect, the boundary was fully transparent, but you still couldn't go past it. The way the arena works right now, if you either run out of time or quit the fight doesn't actually stop, which leaves your characters vulnerable to the boss's attacks while you both can't defend yourself and sometimes can't even see what's going on. I'm almost positive this is unintended and will be fixed, but right now, this is very frustrating to deal with. The last negative is actually something I quite like, but I imagine more casual players don't. The health being sapped from your team after the 3-minute mark can be considered as something that might need some tweaking. Now, like I said, I don't mind it, but I'm already the sort of player who enjoys characters like Dan Jin who sacrifice their own health to either do more damage or use special attacks. So not only does this not really affect me that much, but I also don't really want to see this changed, as in my opinion, 3 minutes is enough time for a team to beat a hologram, but for the people who want to play safer and take their time with difficult fights, I imagine this can feel very punishing. So those are my thoughts on the 2 new holograms. But which one is more difficult? Unfortunately, that really depends on not only the player, but also the team they're using. Fallacy is pretty easy, but it also hits like a truck, or in this instance, a hammer. And the Sentry doesn't quite hit as hard, but its abilities and more complex moveset more than make up for it. So in my opinion, the harder hologram is the Sentry. Sentry took way more attempts for me to clear solo than Fallacy did. It's way more frustrating to fight, has a more complex moveset, and requires a lot more knowledge and better reactions if you don't have a strong team to clear it quickly. However, if you have a full team with a healer that can revive, and you also use the revive consumables, I think Fallacy is a harder fight. And the reason for that is, it can kill your characters a hell of a lot quicker than Sentry can. So a good summary, both of them are difficult, just different types of difficulty. However, what about when they're compared to the rest of the holograms? Is one of them hard enough to be the new king? For this bit, I'm again going to give 2 opinions. First is the difficulty for a team, and second is difficulty for solo players. In terms of team difficulty, I do think Fallacy is the new king of holograms. Inferno Rider and Crownless just don't hit hard enough. Tempest, for whatever reason, has become really easy to stagger, making him pretty simple to beat. I really hope that they fix that. Aches has too little health, Monkey is too predictable, and Heron is a very average run-of-the-mill boss. However, in terms of solo difficulty, I don't think either of them can compete with Inferno Rider. When I was fighting the Sentry, I was thinking this is absolutely the new hardest hologram for solo players. However, now it is still hard, but it's not too bad. So as much as I want to, because I like both of the holograms, I'm not going to give either of them the solo crown. Inferno Rider just has way too much movement. The movement can push you into attacks. Damage from the meteors can still hit you for a short period of time after the meteor lands. It has a shitload of health and has a damage multiplier for the stage that applies to intro skills, which means solo players don't get to take advantage of it. There's a lot of things in the Inferno Rider fight that you need to take into account, which means in my opinion, it is still the hardest hologram to solo. Overall though, I think both of the new holograms are really great fights with minor issues. So Kuro, you have my official stamp of approval.
Whoa.
It might not be worth much, but you have it.
This is worthless.
So for those of you who are yet to clear the 2 new holograms, I hope that you were able to get some useful tips from this video, and I'll wish you all the best of luck with beating them. If you also want some information on the other holograms, I do have 2 other videos, one for Inferno Rider and the other one covers Heron, Aches, Monkey, Tempest, and Crownless. So I'll leave a link to those videos in the description if you're interested. If you enjoyed the video or got something useful out of it, you can leave a like or a comment. And if you'd like to see more content in future, you can subscribe to the channel. Also, if you have anything to add that I either missed, didn't mention, or I got wrong, feel free to let me know in the comments. I remember on the original hologram video I made, there were 2 really great comments that mentioned things that I didn't. So be sure to also check out the comments for any additional tips from other players. However, that will do it from me. So I hope to see you in the next video, and I'll catch you later. You'll notice Fallacy's phase 2 transition by, well, let's just say she'll let you know.
I'm on my period!
I can't use that.
Yes, you can!